Adho Mukha Svanasana, downward facing dog. So a really complicated pose, and especially complicated, I think, in the shoulders. So let's talk about the sort of ideal alignment before we talk about all the amazing modifications that you can do in this pose, because down dog is a common pose, but doesn't mean it's an easy pose, right? It requires a lot of hamstring flexibility in the Achilles, really good open, like the ability for the shoulders to be really open, but at the same time for the muscles surrounding the shoulder joint to be very strong, right? So there's a lot of balancing that needs to happen here. So the feet are hip width apart, and you can also take them wider. Toes spread, they point towards the floor. The heels yearn back and down. They're centered behind the widest part of the foot. And so if you're looking at someone from behind, remember, you can always see if their two Achilles tendons are in one line. That's one way to see if they kind of have all 10 toes pointing forward. Now, if someone's heels can't touch the ground, that's okay. And we're going to talk about that modification in a second. Otherwise, assuming the legs are straight, the quadriceps engage, kneecaps lift, thighs draw up and back. The thighs are in neutral rotation, okay? So they're not really, we just want neutral, okay? So I sometimes think of the inner thighs spinning back, but that's more like an energetic cue. We don't want to pigeon toe the toes like we do in Prasarita and, really come into full internal rotation. But sometimes some people need to think internal rotation of the thighs spinning back in order to find neutral, right? Especially if they have a dance background or they've spent a lot of their life turned out with their toes turned out, and they're used to turning out a lot at the hip joint. All right, so the pelvis is neutral, and to get the pelvis in neutral, that means that for most people, not all, but they need to think of a more anterior tilt in the pelvis, right? Because we're going to see for many folks, the low back will be in a kyphotic curve in this position. So abs draw up to relieve pressure from the shoulders. So abdominals are engaged here. Front and back ribs are even. That usually requires knitting the front ribs in, which we'll talk about in a minute. Shoulders draw away from the ears to release the upper trapezius. So we want the trapezius muscle relaxed, but we're not jamming the shoulder blades down the back, because we know that when we have the arms overhead and external rotation, we don't want to deliberately depress the scapula. That will cause a lot of crunchiness in the shoulders. And we, again, want the humerus to have nice, sweet space between the acromion process. And if we depress the shoulder blades while the arms are overhead, there could be some crunchiness there. Okay. Weight evenly distributed across the knuckles of both hands. The weight is really in the knuckles as opposed to the wrists. The arches of the palms lift. That's a really nice cue. And then the ears are in line with the biceps, relaxed jaw, relaxed gaze. So there's so much going on here. The misalignments you're going to see is the stance too long or too narrow. I know people often ask, like, is there a generic cue that you can give for everyone in down dog about how far apart their legs and hands should be? And I really haven't found that there is one. I think the best thing to do is have people in table with shoulders under wrists and hips over knees, and then ask them to draw back into dog from there, and then make adjustments as needed. Keep in mind someone's dog stance and their plank stance, like if they were going to hold plank for a long time or hold down dog, could be totally different, right? It's not like when we all rock forward to plank from down dog, we're magically in perfect plank alignment. Now, if we're just going through plank and chaturanga as a transition, that's not a big deal. But if we were going to ask our students to move from down dog to plank and hold plank then for 5-10 breaths, we'd want to also cue them to adjust their stance, do some micro foot shuffling and check out where their body is in space. Okay, if the spine is overly kyphotic, the student usually needs to bend the knees, widen the stance, and tip the pelvis more anteriorly. So we'll look at examples of this. If the spine is overly lordotic, right, the student needs to draw the tailbone towards the heels, pull the navel in, and draw the front ribs down and lift the back ribs up. So we're going to talk more about the ribs in a second. I have a little video I'll play for you. If the shoulders are elevated by the ears, they need to draw the shoulder blades down the back and towards each other. Find external rotation of the upper arms and reach the sternum forward. If the head is dropped, you need to give them that cue to have align the ears with biceps or to gaze forward. That's usually the two easiest things to say to people, gaze forward between your hands. And if they're sitting in the joints, they're overly flexible. They really need to press the floor away, engage the ribs, pull the legs back and the belly in. There's so many modifications, right? If you have tight hamstrings, just bend the knees. Tell your students to bend the knees. There's no shame in bending the knees really deeply. In fact, it feels really good and helps you achieve length in the spine. If someone has tight shoulders or is having a hard time finding external rotation at the shoulder joint, you can tell them to widen their arms more than shoulder distance apart. They can take their middle fingers towards the left and right of the mat. So their palms are kind of opening towards the sides of the room. You can have them bend their elbows to find external rotation. You could even have them grip the sides of the mat, right? Like hold the sides of the mat as if they're squeezing the sides of the mat in between fists. That's also can be interesting for folks when they don't really know how to engage their upper body in dog. If someone has a hamstring injury, you can externally rotate the thighs just so the stretch isn't quite so extreme in the hamstrings. Wrist issues, you can place a wedge under the hands, like a yoga jelly, or you can just roll the mat a couple times. Make sure that they have their wrist on the support, so their wrist is elevated and their fingers are back down on the floor. You can also take hands-on blocks. I love hands-on blocks for pregnant folks, if pregnant folks want to do downward facing dog. Puppy pose, in addition to dolphin, is great for people with wrist injuries or who maybe don't like having, who down dog is like too intense an inversion for them. The blood rushes to their head or something like that. Puppy is great. Dolphin's great for those with wrist issues. And there's so many variations with the blocks. You can have the hands on blocks. You can rest the head on a block. You can squeeze the block between the thighs. Let's look at the teaching cues. So this is a metaphor that I like to use, and you'll see it in the video that's included with this material. It's called 60-second down dog fix or something like that. But you want to think of your palms as if they were on two giant dials. They wanted to spin in towards one another, and your biceps want to spin out. So we have external rotation at the shoulder joint, but pronation of the palm, right, where the radius and ulna are. Imagine your tailbone hanging from a chandelier in the ceiling. I love that one. Imagine you could, talk about the breath here, right? Breathe the back body wider, really encourage length in the spine. So our teaching cues, we always want to tell people first to spread the fingers wide, see the color of the mat between your fingers, right? Because our hands are now our base, or half our base. The feet are the other base. In this pose, there's a lot of weight being borne on the palms. So we want to make sure that the fingers are spread wide, that people have a nice, good foundation. Press down through the knuckles, especially the index finger and thumb. I find this helps folks. And you can also say, put your body weight more into the knuckles of your hands than your wrists, and then engage your abdominals up and back. Bend your knees deeply, press your chest towards your thigh bones, hug your abs up and in, slowly straighten the legs. Yearn your sitting bones toward where the back wall meets the ceiling. That's similar to the chandelier cue. Knit your front ribs closed. We'll show and talk about that in a minute. Draw your sits bones up and back. Spiral your biceps to the left and right of the room. That's the same thing about, thinking about the spinning the biceps out. And I'll draw this on someone to make it clear. Bring your ears in line with your biceps. Send the breath wide into your low back. So now I'm going to show a little excerpt, a clip of me talking about this issue of the ribs and knitting the ribs together, because it's important in all yoga, but especially becomes interesting in down dog. And I'll also show some of the common misalignments that you'll see in students' shoulder blades, their scapula. So that video is going to play for you now. Dance teacher really helped me with this, right? Because a lot of us, we think good posture is like taking the shoulders back and like opening here, right? Just across the chest and the collarbones. But look what happens when I do that, right? What happens is I thrust my chest back so much that then in order to come into like a neutral place with my head, I actually come into forward head with the cervical, and the cervical like curve would flatten. Can you guys see that? So what you actually want to do, instead of just thrusting the chest open like a peacock, is, as crazy as it sounds, knit these front ribs together. It's hard work. It's like a wrapping, like saran wrap of them wrapping together. And then your head's going to truly align over your tailbone. And it might feel like your head is like, it might feel like you're leaning forward when you do this. Like when I first started doing this, it felt to me like I was way forward here, but it's actually perfect alignment. Okay. So just food for thought as we continue. Was that helpful? Or hopefully I didn't confuse people more. So the different misalignments you're going to see, right, are people who can't externally rotate their shoulders at the shoulder joint, and they're going to look like this. Okay. Do you see it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, it looks so pinched.
Going to, you see, you'll say, relax your traps, right? They're going to sometimes have their scapula elevated, which looks kind of like this. It's slightly different. Here, someone, even though they're in the external rotation, they might have their traps elevated. You could say soften, right? And then the people who are going too far, they're going to look like this, right? Pressing the torso too far back towards the thighs. You're going to want to bring them back to here. Okay, so this picture is awesome because we're seeing what we see in a lot of students in downward facing dog, which is the, you can see how his spine is kyphotic, right? So really simple. If he bends the knees deeper, he's going to be able to find more length in the spine. So we're going to ask him to bend the knees. We're going to ask him to send his tailbone towards where the back wall meets the ceiling. All of that is going to help his spinal curves come into neutral. He's just going to have a lot more spaciousness. And then it seems like he kind of, his hips, his feet are definitely wider than hip width apart. But it seems like it's, like his toes are kind of pointing out, and they're like kind of not in the full modification and not hip width apart. So for someone like this, I just say take your feet as wide as the mat, right? Let's just get both his feet as wide as the mat, maybe even big toe on mat, pinky toe on wood. Have him bend the knees and just have him find that length in the spine. For most of your students, once you can get them to really generously bend the knees and kind of inspire them that this pose is about more than a hamstring stretch. Downward dog is about length in the spine, and it's also about strengthening the upper body, right? When students bend their knees, then all of a sudden they are supporting their weight with their hands and their core by their navel moving up and in. They're often shocked. They're like, oh my gosh, it feels like I'm doing a handstand in your upper body. And I actually use that cue with people a lot. It should feel like you're doing a handstand in your upper body. It should be a lot of work for the rotator cuff muscles, for your core, for the biceps hugging in towards one another. So other things would ask him to take his ears in line with his biceps, right? Because we can see his head is really hanging down. We want more of that neutral cervical curve. And then it's hard to see from this angle what's going on with his shoulders. So first I just focus on getting length in the spine, right? That's always like priority number one. And then we could see if maybe he wants to walk the hands out a little bit as well, or micro bend the elbows. It looks like there's not a ton of external rotation happening in the bicep. And I'll just show this while we're here. But again, remember I talked about the biceps spinning out, or the upper arm spinning out. So he wants to think of this right bicep spinning towards the right. That's going to help him find external rotation in the shoulder joint. But he's going to think of his palms on little dials spinning medially. Okay, so try that in your own body, and it's also shown in that 60-second fix video with graphics, which is really clear. But it really kind of helps take your down dog to a new level in terms of how you engage the upper body. Awesome. So what we see here is that she has her feet wider than hip width apart. That's fine. It's kind of helping her find length in the spine. So like we're all for it. And what I love is that she's taking the hands a little wider apart than they need to be, but it looks like she has a lot of spaciousness in the shoulders because of that, right? So what we also see is that we have this kind of line of energy from her palm all the way up through her sits bones, right? Her spine just seems to kind of be in its nice, long, neutral curves. And her biceps are in line with her ears, which is awesome. Also looks really nice, right? And if she wanted to occasionally bend the knees or rise up on the heels, she could play with, pressing the chest towards the thigh bones. Not too much though, because it looks like everything's really in sweet alignment. We can see that the thumb is not fully pressing down into the mat. So we're going to say root down through your index finger, knuckle, and thumb, but the biceps are in line with the ears. Looks really, really nice. And, some people's heels will just never touch the ground in downward dog, and that's okay. Awesome. So she is up on the tippy toes. She's bending the knees. Personally, I like to tell people to have the legs kind of really wide and straight, or to have them more like hip width with the knees bent. She's kind of in between the two, which is okay. I just worry that sometimes people don't feel as stable. But assuming she feels stable and happy here, there's a lot of really great things going on. Because she's bent the knee, she's able to find length in the spine. She wants to focus on pressing her chest towards her thigh bones a little bit more if she can, right? We don't know what's going on with her shoulders. My guess is she maybe can't, because if we look at her shoulder up close here, we can see that it's maybe struggling to find some external rotation. So for her, taking the hands wider, farther apart could be really interesting for her to just sort of see if, does that, taking the palms as wide as the mat, or maybe even angling the middle fingers towards the left and right of the room, is all of a sudden is the arm able to become more straight. And again, I don't really care if the arm's straight or bent. Bending the arms is a great way to kind of figure out what's going on in your shoulders. But I think it might help her find more external rotation in the shoulder. Looks really nice. And even in students who, have a really strong dog, she could still find more length in the spine if she just went through the mini exercise of rising up onto releve, lifting her heels, bending her knees, sending her sits bones and her tailbone towards the ceiling, like to that chandelier up here, and then re-lengthening, right? So it looks really good. But remember, like there's never too much length in the spine. Nice, looks really good. Also looks really good. Maybe she can find a little bit more external rotation in the shoulder joint. It's hard to tell from this angle. All right, so she's off her mat. So I'm guessing she's modifying or doing it as she needs to be for the clicker. Overall, everything looks good. We want her to root down through the knuckles. And, I don't know why both hands aren't on the mat, but I'm sure there's a story. Looks really good, right? Looks really, really good. So you can see her sits bones yearning up and back. She's managed to get the heels to the ground. And again, this is just like how flexible are your Achilles, right? Some of us have flexible Achilles. Some of us don't have, some of us have flexible hamstrings. Some of us don't. So again, think of it, the goal is more to focus on the upper body and stability, because there's tons of poses that are going to stretch our hamstrings. And if we look up close and personal at her shoulders, it looks like the shoulders aren't crowding the ears. Maybe she could work to find more external rotation. And even if you're here, right, you're still energetically thinking biceps spin out, right? Biceps spin out, palm spin in, and just keep playing with that. And then engage the abdominals. Maybe she could knit the front ribs a tiny bit, right? But we're nitpicking at this point. So here's a perfect example of the student who you want to say, bend your knees, right? So she's so excited because her heels are touching the ground. So again, this is like where your re-education as the teacher comes in. They're going to say, hey, can you bend the knees? Hey, can you find a nice long spine? Send your tailbone up towards the ceiling. Sometimes when you say bend the knees, like people really don't want to do it. And so I even say, bend your knees so much so that your knees touch the mat, right? So I get them to bend that low. So I say, bend your knees so much that your knees touch the mat. Okay, now shoot your tailbone high to the sky. All of a sudden they're in this nice long spine. And then it says, okay, now think of re-straightening the legs, or, you just have them, as they lift the sits bones, they kind of come out of this extreme crouch that you put them in. And then she could probably use a little bit more external rotation as well. But looks good. And just remember, there's so many poses that stretch the hamstrings, right? So again, this is like a re-education of our students that down dog doesn't have to be about the hamstrings. We want down dog to be about stabilizing the upper body and finding length in the spine. So here we have someone going in the opposite extreme. So she's pressing her chest so much towards her thigh bones that it's going almost a little bit past what's safe for her shoulders. So we want her, she's a classic example of she needs to knit her front ribs in. Yeah. Knit the front ribs in. And that will, it'll just take the shoulder. She'll just be up a little bit more, like here. right? So the shoulder just won't be so compromised. Again, you can think as like if she was standing in, if we chopped her here and she was standing in Tadasana, it's not too bad, but it's like, I feel like her arms are going back a little farther behind her ears than we want them to be. So again, we see the kyphosis in the spine. So we want to ask her to bend the knees. Ooh, interesting. So if she bent the knees, she would be able to send her torso closer to her thigh bones. Yeah. Which I think would feel nice and feel good for her. And she's going to keep thinking of the external rotation at the shoulders. But I love how her fingers are so spread and looks like the weight is evenly distributed through the palms. Here we have someone who needs to knit the front ribs together, right? Ooh, beautiful. So this is a really awesome, I mean, it's like, people are like, well, that's not down. No, this is downward dog. It's a modified dog, but it's one that prioritizes length in the spine, which is the thing we're most interested in. And trust me, the student who's in this shape is working 1,000,000 times harder than the student who has their heels on the ground and kyphosis in the spine. Yeah, so this looks just totally awesome. I love it. Looks nice. She might be someone who could knit the front ribs in a tiny bit. Not so much because the shoulder's out of alignment, but just I can see that they might be splayed open. So she wants to really turn on her core. Another case of, let's knit the front ribs together. We can see a little bit through this dent in her shoulder that she's maybe, that instead of continuing the energetics of pressing the torso towards the thigh, she maybe wants to focus on the energetics of abdominal engagement and knitting the ribs together. So here we see her heels are on the ground, yay, but is she muscularly engaging? Is there work happening in the shoulders? Is she, going to break a sweat in this position? Probably not. She's just kind of hanging out, right? So this is where, again, it's so shocking for your students when you ask them to turn all 10 toes to face forward, bend the knees so much so that they're going to touch the mat, send the sitting bones high to the sky, externally rotate at the shoulder joint. And all of a sudden they're like, oh my gosh, this is exhausting. All my body weight is like in my upper body. I feel like I'm doing a handstand. And you're like, yep. Nice, looks pretty good. Press the knuckles down. Looks good, right? Really nice modification. Also looks good. I'm wondering if it might be interesting for Michelle to play with taking the hands a little bit farther apart, just to play, just to see, not because she has to, but I wonder if she just might find a little bit more spaciousness in the shoulder if the, she took the middle fingers and pointed them out a little bit diagonally, or the arms a little wider. Sometimes it's nice to do something like that just for like 4 to 6 weeks and then go back to your normal dog and see what shifted for you, what's changed. So it looks good. We love that she's bending the knees. She might just want to walk her hands forward, right? Walk her hands forward and then maybe take the hands wide as well, because we can see there's perhaps a struggle to find that external rotation at the shoulder joint. Looks nice. So here's a really cool example where we can see the scap elevated, right? So her scapula's up, so her shoulders are also up by her ears in this position. So a lot of things that are going to help would be taking the arms wider, telling her, don't say glide your shoulder blades down and back, but say, can you soften the shoulders? Can you widen the shoulder blades apart from one another? That will kind of help counteract this. Looks really good, except we want her really pressing through the palms. Another thing or analogy you can use here is telling people to think of like putting on those long party gloves, like Breakfast at Tiffany's, like long party gloves to really pull up through the arch of the hand. Again, award for creative shot, and looks good, except that she's kind of going to her max range in terms of what's safe for the shoulder. So we want her to knit the front ribs in, bring her ears in line with the biceps. And yeah, maybe bend the knees. Honestly, there's just like a tiny bit of kyphosis. So again, sometimes just bending the knees for a couple breaths and re-lengthening, right? I love doing that movement of rising onto the heels, bending the knees, re-extending tailbone towards sky, and then seeing where you end up. Looks great, except we want her to knit the ribs in and engage the abs more. Another, knit ribs in, right? And it's hard to tell how much external rotation is happening at the shoulder. But if she's not finding a lot, maybe she could micro bend the elbows. Again, practice with your elbows micro bent for just 6 weeks or so and see how that changes the posture for you, what it brings awareness of. So she needs to let her head drop, right? So you'll see this with a lot of your students as well, that they're like, oh, my head and neck are relaxed, but they're not, right? The back of her neck, we want it to be long. We want biceps in line with ears. It looks like she's doing kind of the hands on the diagonal modification, and it's serving her really well, right? We can see looking at her shoulder, if she took her hands shoulder distance exactly apart, she wouldn't be able to find the sukha, the space she has between the shoulders and the ears, the external rotation she has when she chooses to take the hands wider. So really awesome that she's doing that. Looks nice. Maybe knit the ribs in just a touch. Awesome. Another one for knitting the ribs in, right? So we can see if she were standing with her arms overhead, whoa, she would be taking her arms like way back, right? She wouldn't be in Urdhva Hastasana. She would be in, like potentially crunchy place in terms of shoulder impingement. So it's, time to knit the front ribs in and for her to focus more on core. Because what comes with the front ribs splaying open is, I feel like people who have a lot of mobility, myself included, we kind of just then hang out in the shoulder, and over time that could create injury. So it's better to back off range, right? And see if we can really start figuring out how to muscularly engage all the little muscles around the shoulder and muscularly engage through the arms and the core to support us here, instead of just kind of trusting the shoulder girdle to catch us like a hammock, if that makes sense. Nice. So this is when we talk about the shoulders being too far back. Because imagine if she were standing, right? Would she be in Urdhva Hastasana? No, this is extreme. This is an extreme of taking the arms behind the head, which again, if we're standing upright, okay, but now we're bearing weight on that situation, not so anatomically safe. I call anatomical dubious. So knit front ribs in. Again, you could say, if you put your hand on your student here, press your upper back into my hand, just to take her out of it, just a touch. So again, we come back to that idea of the flexies and the stiffies, right? Your stiffies don't want to bend the knees, but that's what they need to do, and they need to send their torso towards their thigh bones. Your flexies are sending the torso towards the thigh bones so much that they're risking shoulder impingement. I don't know where her other arm is. Maybe it's taking the photo, but it looks pretty good. Ideally, you should have both arms on the ground. Maybe a good candidate for taking the arms a little wider, because I don't see a ton of external rotation happening here. Make sure all 10 toes are facing front. And she could bend the knees if she wanted, just for fun, to find more length. Looks awesome. Wants to keep thinking ribs in, wants to keep thinking hands on dials, spinning in, biceps spinning out. It's an active pose. It's not easy. It's such a beautiful modification of taking the feet wide, right? And then she just needs to press down through the palm here. But looks really good. Looks good. Oh, we got the bebe. So having the feet wide and the hands wide is interesting. It starts to feel a little less like traditional dog because you're just so wide. So I would encourage, if you're teaching someone, do one or the other. So if you're going to teach the arms super wide, then have the feet hip width apart with the knees deeply bent. And if you're going to have the feet super wide, maybe don't also teach them the arm wide modification at the same time. But, for all intents and purposes, her spine is long. It looks like she has external rotation at the shoulders. And yeah, looks pretty good if she's comfortable there. So here, bending the knees and maybe a little bit of a longer stance in her dog, right? So it looks almost like she's like between a dog and an Uttanasana, forward fold. Yeah. So remember, we want the pelvis in neutral best we can, even though we're now upside down. So her pelvis feels like more of a posterior pelvic tilt, right? If we imagine this as the floor. So I think lengthening her stance a little bit and asking her to bend the knees will really help. So here's a person who's a great candidate for taking the hands wider, right? Why? Because we can see that external rotation isn't naturally happening at the shoulder. So she takes the hands wider apart from one another, and then not just that, but also the hands on a little bit of a diagonal. She'll get a lot more space here. Looks good. Looks good. Knit those ribs in and press down through the knuckles too, right? So this is an awesome photo because we can see, and when you look at people in down dog, that's why I wanted to include the video that I included at the beginning, because you're really looking a lot at these shoulder blades and what's going on in this whole area. Yeah. So this looks great, right? We can see there's so much space between her shoulders and her ears. Her scapula look like they're naturally elevated and protracting, just like they would if she lifted her arms above her head in Urdhva Hastasana, right? This is why we look at Urdhva Hastasana and downward dog together. So it's just in that sweet spot, the natural elevation and the natural protraction, right? And then she's pressing down through the knuckles, and the trapezius is relaxed. So yeah, looks really nice. Also looks nice, although we want more external rotation in the shoulders for her. So she wants to think of the biceps again spinning. We'll draw it. Spinning out. And if she's feeling like jammed, like she can't get that, that's where taking the hands wider, even if it's just for your own self as like an experiment for a couple of weeks, try it. And then we also want the heel behind the widest part of the foot, just because we can see that from this photo angle so clearly. And we want all 10 toes forward. That will give her a much deeper and different hamstring stretch when she really centers this heel behind the widest part of the foot. Looks good. Maybe more external rotation at the shoulders. And again, just play with it. I really encourage you all, just take the arms wider for a period of time and see how much beautiful external rotation you can find. Feel how good it feels. And practice with that, and then remember it and bring it back into your normal dog alignment. Looks good. Press through the knuckles. She could micro bend the knees in this photo if she wanted to get even more length in the spine. We see just a tiny bit of kyphosis in the lumbar, and same here, right? Same story. Bend the knees, maybe lengthen the stance a tiny bit. Really nice. Ooh, interesting. This photo is interesting because I feel like she's doing the thing that a lot of our flexi hypermobile shoulder girdle people do, which is pressing the torso too far towards the thigh bones. But at the same time, we can see she doesn't have external rotation, right? So she wants to knit the front ribs in, take the arms wider. I think maybe she wants to take the feet closer together, because having both the feet wide and the arms wide together can be I don't know, it just doesn't, it's not so stable, I don't think. So for her, I would say bring the feet hip width apart, bend the knees deeply, take the arms wide, take the hands at a diagonal, so your middle fingers are pointing to the corners of the room, and get her to engage the ribs and the abs so that her upper body would move a little bit forward, and hopefully should find more external rotation and spaciousness here. She needs to engage the abs and knit the front ribs together, right? You can see a little bit of the crunchiness that's potentially happening, right? Might feel fine for her now, but long term, we want her to back off her range and engage more muscularly. Really nice. Really, really nice modification with the knees bent. Knit the front ribs in. Looks good. Maybe a little bit more external rotation can be happening in the shoulders. I feel like her scap might be a little too elevated, because again, that's naturally going to elevate, naturally going to protract, but it might be a little too much. It's hard to tell. Playing with having the hands wider could be nice. Looks good. We want her biceps, so we want her to gaze forward, right? So her head comes more in line with her biceps. And then it's interesting. It's like her palms are kind of pointing in towards one another. I would say, respread the fingers wide, press down through the knuckles. Let's get all these fingers like pie slices between every finger. See the mat between your fingers. These are all good things you can say. And maybe have her fingers point a little bit to the diagonal. It's hard to see what's going on in her low back, but she might need to bend the knees slightly as well to find a long spine. Just a little bend in the knees, sending the sits bones higher to the sky is going to get her out of this kyphosis that's happening in the lumbar. Nice, looks good. Also looks really good. Nice, we can see she has a lot of length in the spine. Also nice. Looks good. Knit the ribs in, right? Knit the ribs in, knit the ribs in. We don't want to go too far past the safety zone. Looks really good. Make sure the heel is really behind the widest part of the foot. Looks good. I wish I had a photo from the front, like from this angle, to see what's going on in her shoulders, because I'm not sure, but I feel like either her traps or her scaps might be elevated. It's hard for me to know from this angle. Looks really good. Keep thinking about more external rotation, but looks good. And also looks good. Really nice. Press down through the knuckles. I know some people are holding their remotes to take the picture. So she can think about pressing the chest towards the thigh bones a little bit more and really regrounding through the hands. So that's our downward facing dog, Adho Mukha Svanasana.